Hey, comic fans, thank you so much for joining us. Dave here at Ground Zero. You know, one of my all time favorite supervillains, and certainly one of the biggest, baddest, most cosmic villains in the entire DC universe, is this guy. Can you imagine the DC universe without Darkseid? I certainly cannot, and it would be a completely different place. But he almost wasn't a part of the DC universe. In fact, he and several other characters almost belong to another comic book company. And that's the story we're going to tackle in today's segment of Interestingly Enough. Our story goes back to April of 1969. Carmen Infantino, who was at that time the editorial director for DC Comics, flew from New York to California. He was there to work some business for DC's behalf for some cartoon properties they were licensing out. Well, while he was there, he called up an old friend because Jack Kirby was currently living in Irvine, California. Now, Infantino had known Kirby since the 40s, and as old friends, he suggested they get together for dinner. Well, Roz and Jack Kirby invited Carmen over for dinner that night. And before the dinner was even over, Jack invited Carmen into his studio, where he pulled out 3 giant pieces of art. Now, these were characters and properties that Carmen Infantino had not even heard of. They were for the Forever People, Orion of the New Gods, and Mr. Miracle. He was pretty dazzled by what he saw, and he said to Kirby, "Very impressive. Are you guys really going to publish all this?" To which Kirby replied, No, I want to come to DC and have DC put this out. This was a bombshell. This was a lightning bolt because Marvel at that point was on a creative run that was unparalleled. They were quickly eclipsing DC in sales, and DC had no idea what to do about them. And the person most identified with Marvel's creative success was Jack Kirby. It was unthinkable that he would work for anybody else. But he was unhappy at Marvel at that point for a few reasons. One of them was his relationship with Stan Lee. Stan Lee was getting the lion's share of the credit for the Marvel Universe, and this kind of bothered Jack. But Stan Lee was a natural salesman, and so he did most of the interviews. And he always denied it and said, "I am very effusive in my praise for everybody and give credit where credit's due. The articles just don't seem to mention that part. But I always say Jack Kirby did a lot, Steve Ditko did a lot. I can't help it if they don't print these things." Well, whatever the reason, Jack Kirby was not too pleased. Second, for years he had been wanting at least some co-writing credits on some of the books. He did the plotting, he did the pacing, he did so much on the books, everything usually but fill out the dialogue balloons. But Marvel steadfastly refused to do that. Third, turned out to be money. He felt like he was undercompensated because he was seeing so many of his creations start to be licensed for TV projects, posters, t-shirts, and he wasn't getting anything from it. This was a problem for Jack Kirby. And it was also this same year that Joe Simon finally settled his court case over Captain America. A couple of years earlier, when Captain America's first copyright had hit its 29-year renewal period, Joe Simon sent lawyers on his behalf to secure the copyrights for the first 10 issues. Those are the ones that Joe Simon and Jack Kirby together created. He was successful, and he got those issues. And with it, he tried to secure some movie rights and other forms of deals. Well, Martin Goodman was not going to take this lying down, and this quickly went to court. And it was a court battle that was bitter and ugly, and Jack Kirby was caught in the middle. Caught in the middle between a creator that he very much sympathized with and the company that signed his checks. Ultimately, a lot of his testimony did not go in Joe Simon's favor, and Joe Simon settled out of court for $7,500. Now think about that. The rights to Captain America for $7,500. But that's the way the industry was back then. Now, Martin Goodman had promised an equal sort of settlement to Jack Kirby for his help. But Martin Goodman being Martin Goodman, it didn't happen. So Kirby was particularly unhappy, and his contract was due up for renewal, and he gets the package in the mail, rips the envelope open, and is just incensed at what he sees. He had been lobbying for a raise in his page rate for years. There was no raise. He was getting the same page rate he had gotten for the past several years. There was no credit for characters he had co-created. There was not even any job security. The contract said Marvel could fire him at any time for any reason. And even worse, insult to injury, signing that contract waived any right he would have to ever sue Marvel for any misdeeds, past or even future. No way was he going to sign that contract. So in 1970, he started really working with DC. Now, he signed a contract in 70 with DC, 5 years, which was 3 years plus then 2 years of option. And once he did that, he knew he could actually make his move. So on March 6, 1970, he mailed his final pages to Marvel, the completed book for Fantastic Four number 102. And as soon as they were securely in the mail, he called Stanley and gave him the news. And not only that, he started drawing his very first book for DC that very same day. Now, he asked John Romita to go with him to DC because, as he told Romita, what he really wanted to do was less drawing and more creating. He just burst with ideas, more ideas than he could physically get on the page. That was Jack Kirby. And so what he really wanted was to create a whole line of characters and have talented creators that could make those into reality. Romita thought about it, but decided if he did it, he would forever be in Jack Kirby's shadow. And ultimately, he was probably right. It's hard to get out of the shadow of Jack Kirby. Now, one group that was particularly pleased about this was DC, and they immediately started a blitzkrieg of advertising. The king is coming to DC. The great one is coming. They wanted the world to know they had gotten Marvel's prize creator. Everybody was excited. Fans couldn't wait to see what would happen because no one could imagine Jack Kirby drawing for anybody else. Now, the legend has it that he went to DC and immediately asked them for their lowest selling book. That's actually not quite right. What the deal was DC did want him to take over an existing book to get started. Kirby did not want to take over a book that already had a creator attached to it. Finally, they came up with a compromise. Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen was not DC's lowest selling book, but it was between creators at the moment. So Kirby took over that book, even though it was a really odd choice for Jack Kirby. In October of 1970, issue number 133 comes out, and it's the beginning of Jack Kirby's tenure with DC. But right away, he starts pouring out ideas. We get introduced to Morgan Edge. We get the return of the Newsboy Legion, an earlier creation of Jack Kirby's. We get a completely different tone for the book. It is just nothing like what Jimmy Olsen had been before. Right away, he was making his mark. And the very next issue, we would get a teaser for Darkseid, with a little bit more of a cameo after that. Now, Darkseid himself wouldn't appear until March of 71 in the first issue of Forever People. And this broke open the whole Fourth World saga. Because 3 weeks after Forever People number 1 hit the stands, the flagship title, New Gods. Now, New Gods and Forever People were all part of a giant tapestry, along with the third book, Mr. Miracle, which had premiered the very next month. Now, this was an ambitious story. It was a cosmic clash between gods. On one side, New Genesis, the pure gods, led by Highfather. On the other side, Apocalypse, a dark, hellish kind of place, led by the evil Darkseid. Now, there was a pact between these two worlds. They had exchanged sons of their rulers. Scott Free, the son of Highfather, went to Apocalypse, where he ultimately escaped, and that's how he became Mr. Miracle. And then Orion was actually Darkseid's son who had grown up on New Genesis. This was a giant tapestry of a story, and it got pretty complicated pretty fast. Forever People was designed to be the teenage gods of that whole saga, very much influenced by what Jack Kirby saw in the youth around him. Remember, this was the Vietnam era, and there was a lot of changes in counterculture in the younger people of that day. Grant Morrison has since likened this story to basically being like somebody slipped LSD into Johnny DC's Kool-Aid. And it was. It just crackled. It burst with creative ideas. I mean, boom tubes, the mother box, demonic shock troops. There was so much coming out of Kirby at this time that the pages really couldn't all hold it. And he had so many more ideas. He wanted oversized magazine formats. And he envisioned this giant tapestry of story being collected into square-bound books. I mean, come on. Square-bound books. That's crazy. That was not going to happen. You just don't put comics into books. But those were his thoughts. Now, the further we go in the saga, things start to change a little bit. And in issue number 6 of Mr. Miracle, he introduces a character by the name of Funky Flashman. Funky Flashman bore an uncanny resemblance to Stan Lee. Now, considering that the character was a shameless huckster and a con man, and considering that the first thing he tries to do in the book is take advantage of Mr. Miracle's talent, Jack Kirby was definitely getting a dig in at Stan Lee, and Stan Lee was not pleased. Okay, so the books are coming out, but you're probably thinking, okay, they're not still happening today so much. What happened? Well, what happened is this. The first few issues sold incredibly well, but then the numbers started dropping. Now, why? Well, there's one possible lesser explanation for this, and that was just a few months into the saga, DC had an entire line-wide price hike. Now, it wasn't just a little price hike. They went from 15 cents to 25 cents. This was a massive price increase, and it really cost DC because Marvel books then only went to 20 cents. We'll actually cover that a lot more in just about the next segment. This hurt sales across DC's line and definitely could have been a factor. But honestly, the numbers were starting to fall anyway, and really the concepts were just too complicated for comic readers in the early 70s. They just weren't used to it, and you had to read a lot of books to follow the story. Another thing comic readers just weren't used to. So sadly, the numbers dropped and dropped and dropped some more until finally in late 1972, DC made the difficult decision to cancel two of the titles. New Gods and Forever People were both canceled essentially mid-story. They were not allowed to complete them. Now, Mr. Miracle kind of morphed into a more traditional superhero title, and it kept going at least for a while longer. Now, Kirby then got to work on some other titles for DC and came up with several. OMAC, the demon character, which lasted actually to today. And then his most successful creation for DC, at least at the time, Commanding. Now, Commanding actually did pretty well and ultimately went for 59 issues. But by this point, the bloom was off the rose, and Kirby would ultimately return to Marvel. Now, coincidentally, they did resurrect the New Gods in 1977. New Gods comes back in Return of the New Gods, but by this point, Kirby is long gone. Now, also happening in 1977, you might remember a little movie called Star Wars. Even at the time, a lot of people noticed a lot of similarities between the concepts from New Gods and some of the concepts in Star Wars. Orion called on their mystical source for help when he needed it to confront his evil father, Darkseid. Luke Skywalker called on the Force for help in confronting his evil father, Darth Vader. A little too much to ignore, but Kirby took it in stride. In fact, his feeling was it just shows what good commercial ideas they were. That was Jack Kirby. He was used to the business. Now, there is something of a postscript because in 1984, Kirby did come back to DC and do a graphic novel called The Hunger Dogs that was designed to tie up the loose ends from the Forever People and New Gods storyline. And it did it, but there was a couple of problems. One is it was 10 years later, and at this point, Kirby had changed as creator, and he was no longer quite as passionate about this story. Second is he was under orders not to change the status quo of any of the characters, and his original intention was that some of these characters would not make it out of this story alive. That obviously had to change for this particular book. Now, if you're really interested in this story, and you should be, best place to go is this, New Gods. DC's got it reprinted in a nice big thick book. It's good. Now, it's Kirby, so understand, it's over-the-top, unrealistic, operatic dialogue, but it absolutely crackles off the page with energy because that's what Kirby did. If you're looking for gritty, realistic drama, you don't want Jack Kirby. That's not what he does. But if you want work that is electrifying, that absolutely just throws so much stuff at you that your head's going to spin for a week, then Jack Kirby is the guy. Now, other than New Gods, if you're going to be a comic fan, you got to read Jack Kirby and Stan Lee's run on Fantastic Four. And really, for that matter, you need to read their run on Thor. They're both classics, deservedly so. This is where comics really changed at that point in through the 60s. They're all excellent work. You know, ultimately, while it wasn't as long as we all would have liked, a lot of people viewed Kirby's tenure at DC as a failure, as something of a mistake, but it really wasn't. It's unfortunate the way it turned out in not completing the Fourth World Saga. But DC got him there because of his his ideas and his ability to pour forth so much stuff to add to a universe. And he did just that. There are so many concepts that came out of his books that DC still regularly incorporates today. And let's face it, Darkseid's still around, and he is still the baddest guy in the entire DC universe. Left there by the absolute king himself, Jack Kirby. Guys, thank you so much. Take care of yourself, please. If you have any comments or suggestions, we'd love to hear them. That's what we got comments. Guys, have a great day.